In the bustling heart of Los Angeles, within the walls of the county courthouse, Marcus Hayes, a 19-year-old young man, found himself facing a future that was uncertain at best. The stakes were high. He was accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest charges that, if proven, could shape the direction of his life in ways he had never anticipated. But what set Marcus apart from countless others in the same situation was not just the gravity of the charges, but the quiet defiance and self-assurance with which he carried himself in that sterile, intimidating courtroom. Despite his youth, Marcus didn't exhibit the fear or hesitation one might expect from someone in his position. Instead, there was a quiet intensity in his posture as he stood at the defendant's table, hands tucked into his pockets, his chin held high in a manner that suggested he had already made peace with the circumstances he was now navigating. To many, he was just another teenager in trouble, a figure of suspicion with a criminal record that threatened to define his future. Yet to those who watched closely, there was something undeniably different about him: a quiet power, an awareness of the system, and a determination to fight back against the odds. Marcus's decision to represent himself in court was not born from arrogance or a lack of respect for the legal system. It was a choice rooted in the years he had spent observing it from the outside, gaining a perspective that many his age would never have the opportunity to acquire. His mother, Monica Hayes, had worked as a paralegal for over a decade, and from a young age, Marcus had sat at the kitchen table, listening intently to her recount the intricacies of legal battles, the shortcuts often taken by prosecutors, and the blind spots within the system that allowed the truth to be lost in favor of convenience. While most teenagers his age memorized sports statistics or game strategies, Marcus absorbed the mechanics of legal proceedings like a sponge. His mind was sharp, honed not just on surviving the courtroom drama, but on understanding it deeply, on seeing the flaws, the biases, and the cracks in the foundation that most people never questioned. This knowledge was the armor that Marcus wore as he faced Judge Charles Reed, a man whose weary eyes and dismissive attitude suggested he had already written Marcus off as another troubled kid with no chance of redemption. To Reed, Marcus was just another defendant, another case to clear from his docket. But Marcus wasn't like the others. He was prepared. He had spent countless hours studying trial transcripts, listening to mock trials, and reading case law. He was ready to face what lay ahead not just as a defendant, but as someone who understood the weight of the system, its flaws and its power. As Marcus stood there calm and poised, he knew that his future was in the hands of a system that had a tendency to favor those who knew how to play the game. But Marcus wasn't here to play by those rules. He was here to show the world that, even in the face of a system stacked against him, a young man with determination and the knowledge to back it up could stand tall and make his voice heard. This trial wasn't just about the charges he faced, it was about something much bigger. A chance to expose the truth and challenge the very system that had decided he was guilty before he even stepped into the courtroom. Initial misjudgment by judge. From the moment Marcus Hayes stepped into the courtroom, he could feel the weight of the judge's gaze bearing down on him. Judge Charles Reed, a man whose career had spanned decades and whose reputation was built on making swift decisions, looked at Marcus with a mixture of weariness and contempt. In his eyes, Marcus was just another young man, another statistic, caught up in a system that had long since lost any sense of compassion or nuance. To Reed, Marcus was an embodiment of every stereotype he had ever come to expect from someone his age and background. He saw a troubled teen, too eager to challenge authority, too naive to understand the intricacies of the world around him. It was clear that Judge Reed had already made up his mind, dismissing Marcus as a mere inconvenience in his otherwise predictable day. The judge leaned back in his chair with an almost theatrical air of disinterest, fingers lazily drumming against the polished wood of his desk. His gaze, obscured by the rim of his glasses, lingered on Marcus for a moment too long, not with curiosity, but with condescension. You think you can outsmart the system, kid? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. This isn't a debate club. Let's move this along. The courtroom, filled with spectators, responded with a ripple of laughter, a collective dismissal of Marcus as just another defendant too caught up in his own delusions. Even the bailiff, the stenographer, and the prosecutor seemed in on the joke. They all saw him as an afterthought, someone to be processed quickly and efficiently. But what none of them understood was that Marcus was far more than they gave him credit for. What Judge Reed failed to see was that this was not just another routine trial. It was an opportunity for Marcus to challenge everything the judge believed to be true. While the courtroom chuckled at Reed's offhand remark, Marcus remained still, his posture unshaken. He didn't flinch, didn't allow himself to be swept up in the mockery that surrounded him. Instead, he stood there, a quiet defiance in his eyes, knowing that this moment, this trial, was going to be different. His calmness was not the result of ignorance but of preparation, a calm born from years of quietly observing the legal world through the lens of his mother's stories and his own self-education. He had spent countless hours understanding the law, the strategies, and the flaws within the system, and he knew exactly how to play the game better than anyone in that room had anticipated. Judge Reed, however, had already dismissed Marcus. In his mind, this was just another case to get through a case that would inevitably end in the same way as all the others. He underestimated Marcus's resilience and his ability to think beyond the limitations of the courtroom. What Reed didn't realize was that by underestimating Marcus, he had made the first mistake of the trial. He had assumed that Marcus was nothing more than a young, ignorant defendant, a simple case in a long line of many. But in that moment, Marcus wasn't just a defendant. He was a young man standing in the face of a system that had long overlooked people like him, and he was ready to prove that he wasn't what anyone thought him to be. In this simple, almost careless moment of misjudgment, Judge Reed revealed the very thing Marcus would challenge, the bias and assumptions that clouded the courtroom that often led to the misinterpretation of young lives. The real trial wasn't about the LeWitt, was about a system that had long since learned to dismiss those who didn't fit its mold. And Marcus was about to show them just how wrong they were. Prosecutor's case? The prosecutor, James Clark, entered the courtroom with the kind of polished confidence that comes from years of routine. His suit was sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, and his posture suggested a man who had already won the battle before it even began. As he stepped forward to present his case, there was an almost rehearsed quality to his words, as though he had delivered this speech 100 times over with the same predictable outcome each time. To him, Marcus Hayes was just another defendant, a simple case, easily handled and quickly resolved. There was no room for doubt in Clark's mind, no need for deep scrutiny. The facts, as he saw them, spoke for themselves. Clark stood before the judge and jury, the weight of his argument rolling off his tongue like a well-practiced script. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Marcus Hayes, was found in a stolen 2022 BMW, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through the streets where he attempted to flee, only to be apprehended shortly after. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the car. The evidence is irrefutable." The words landed with the expected weight, as if Marcus's fate had already been sealed. The audience in the gallery shifted, murmuring amongst themselves. It was an open and shut case, or so it seemed. The stolen car, the chase through the city, the arrest all of it painted a clear and damning picture. It was the kind of case that Clark had seen 100 times before. Nothing particularly extraordinary, nothing worth questioning. The evidence was black and white, and Clark expected the jury to accept it as such. Judge Reed, never one to waste time, glanced at Marcus, then back at Clark. His voice, laced with indifference, echoed through the courtroom. Sounds straightforward enough. Go on, he muttered, his disinterest palpable. Clark seized the moment, moving toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. He seemed to take pleasure in the simplicity of the case, the ease with which he could present the facts and walk away victorious. But there was something more in his delivery, an almost dismissive tone as he turned to address Marcus directly. The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding and that Marcus is the unfortunate victim of circumstance. But let's be real here. What kind of victim runs from the police? It was a rhetorical question, the kind that Clark believed would resonate with the jury, reinforcing his argument and painting Marcus as guilty without ever needing to prove it. The prosecutor's words carried an air of finality, and as he spoke, he glanced back at Marcus with a smirk, fully convinced that the case was already won. But while Clark stood there, confidently outlining his case, he failed to notice the small yet powerful shift taking place in the courtroom. Marcus, despite the heavy weight of the accusations against him, was far from defeated. His calm demeanor and unwavering gaze betrayed a deeper understanding of the situation, one that Clark was blind to. The prosecutor, so certain in his assumptions, had overlooked the possibility that the evidence might not be as straightforward as he thought. For all his confidence, Clark had underestimated Marcus's ability to see beyond the surface, to question the narrative that others had so easily accepted. In that moment, it became clear that this trial wasn't just about proving the defendant's guilt. It was about challenging the very assumptions that had been made about him and about the justice system itself. Clark's case, so neatly wrapped in the illusion of certainty, was about to be undone by the very thing he had failed to consider: the truth. Marcus's defense. Marcus Hayes stood tall, unwavering in his decision to represent himself. The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs and quiet mockery, now fell into a thick silence. It was as though the weight of the room's expectations had shifted from one of dismissal to cautious curiosity. With measured steps, Marcus approached the front of the courtroom, his gaze locked on the jury, his voice steady as he began to dismantle the case that had seemed so airtight only moments before. The evidence presented by the prosecution, his fingerprints on the steering wheel of the stolen car, had seemed like a nail in the coffin. It was a damning piece of information, one that would normally seal a defendant's fate. But Marcus knew that facts, however compelling, were often used to paint a narrative that wasn't always the full story. He wasn't here to argue the details of the car chase or the police report. He was here to peel back the layers of assumption, to expose the cracks in the system that had already decided his guilt before the trial even began. Standing in front of the jury, Marcus addressed the court with calm precision. "Yes, my fingerprints were found on the car," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet room. "But let's take a moment to think about what that really means." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Touching something doesn't make you a criminal. The courtroom held its breath as Marcus laid out his argument. He painted a picture of an ordinary moment, one that anyone could relate to: walking into a store, trying on a jacket, and later walking away, leaving your fingerprints behind. If someone later steals that jacket, does that mean you're the thief? He asked, his eyes sweeping across the jury. Of course not. Just because your fingerprints are on something doesn't make you guilty of stealing it. The simplicity of the analogy hit hard, challenging the narrative the prosecution had worked so hard to build. But Marcus wasn't done. He shifted the conversation to the timeline of events, pointing out that the car in question had been left running outside a 7-Eleven hours before the theft was reported. He had been inside the store with his friends, nothing more than a curious bystander. "I leaned against the car. I touched the door because it was unlocked. I didn't steal it. I didn't drive it. I didn't even think to take it," he explained, each word calculated to strip away the presumption of guilt. He wasn't trying to excuse his action. She was exposing the truth that had been overlooked in favor of assumptions. Marcus turned his attention back to the prosecution's key witness, Officer Lee, the officer who had testified to seeing him behind the wheel of the car. If Officer Lee was where he said he was, Marcus continued, then his GPS logs should confirm it, but I have a feeling they won't. The audacity of this statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Marcus wasn't just challenging the facts. He was forcing the system to prove its own accuracy, to expose its own flaws. The prosecutor shifted uneasily in his seat. Marcus knew he had struck a nerve. His defense wasn't about technicalities or Samantha Sitt, was about challenging the assumptions that had been made about him. He wasn't a criminal simply because the system had labeled him one. He was a young man who had been caught in a web of prejudice and bad police work, and he was finally standing up to fight back. Marcus's calmness, his confidence in the face of overwhelming odds made it clear this wasn't just a case of legal technicalities. It was a chance to reveal how the justice system often operates under the weight of bias and shortcuts, and how a single voice zone that refused to be silenced could shift the course of justice. As he finished his argument, Marcus stood tall, no longer the defendant. He was someone who had taken control of his own fate, someone who had exposed the truth, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward reclaiming his future. As Marcus Hayes stood before the jury, his defense wasn't just a rebuttal to the prosecution's case. It became a confrontation of something much larger, the deeply ingrained injustices that had shaped the circumstances surrounding his arrest. He wasn't simply fighting to clear his name, he was exposing the way the system worked against people like him. In that moment, as he laid bare the truth, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath, recognizing that the case at hand was about more than stolen cars and fingerprints. It was about the assumptions that had already been made about him long before he had even set foot in that courtroom. For Marcus, the real battle wasn't over the evidence or even the charges. It was about dismantling the prejudices that had led to his arrest in the first place. The case against him had been built on a series of rushed conclusions based not on hard evidence, but on the color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it. He was just another young black man walking through a neighborhood where a stolen vehicle had been abandoned, and that alone seemed enough to make him a suspect. The police, Marcus argued, hadn't bothered to dig deeper, to look for real answers. Instead, they had seen him as an easy target, someone who fit the stereotype they had already constructed. When Marcus pointed out the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, he wasn't just challenging the facts. He was pulling back the curtain on a system that often fails to look beyond surface-level assumptions. The police officer who had testified about seeing Marcus behind the wheel had in fact never been where he claimed to be at the time. Marcus called for the officer's GPS logs, something so simple, yet something that had been overlooked. The failure to submit this data wasn't just a small mistake. It was an omission that revealed how easily the truth could be manipulated or ignored. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence Marcus uncovered was the statement from the car's owner, Raymond Whitaker. The car had been left running outside a 7-Eleven, and Whitaker himself had admitted that someone had likely jumped in and taken off with it. But here was the crucial detail. Whitaker, the car's owner, had described the thief as a kid, a description that didn't match Marcus in any way. Whitaker had even said, in his original statement to the police, that the person he saw was white, yet this detail had been conveniently left out of the prosecution's filings. The omission wasn't just an oversight, it was a deliberate attempt to paint Marcus as guilty, to force the narrative that fit the prosecution's case. As Marcus laid out the facts, the impact of his words became undeniable. The prosecution had built its case on assumptions, bias, and the convenience of a narrative that didn't require scrutiny. And the more Marcus spoke, the clearer it became that his arrest wasn't about justice, it was about fitting the pieces of a system that didn't have time to consider the truth. In that moment, as Marcus pointed out the ways the justice system had failed him, the entire courtroom seemed to wake up. It wasn't just about one man standing trial. It was about a system that too often fails to serve those who need it most, about how people like Marcus are judged based on the color of their skin and the biases that come with it. By exposing these truths, Marcus didn't just defend himself, he made the courtroom confront the ugly reality that many others, without the knowledge or the courage to fight back, might never have the chance to do. Marcus's defense wasn't just about proving his innocence, it was about revealing how deeply flawed and unjust the system could be. And in doing so, he became not just a defendant, but a symbol of the struggle for fairness and equality. Judge's decision. As the trial unfolded, Judge Charles Reed had been steadfast in his belief that this case would follow the same predictable path as so many others. He had seen countless defendants, many of them young men like Marcus, walk into his courtroom, only to walk out convicted, their futures sealed by the very system that had been designed to deliver justice. He had no reason to believe this case would be any different. At first, he regarded Marcus with the casual indifference of someone who had been in the game too long. To him, Marcus was just another kid, caught up in circumstances he couldn't control, someone who had been too careless and now had to face the consequences. But as Marcus presented his defense, Reed began to feel something, shift something he hadn't anticipated when he first sat down that morning. Throughout the trial, Marcus had been calm, methodical, and precise in his arguments, presenting not just facts, but a compelling case against the system itself. With every piece of evidence Marcus exposed, Reed's carefully constructed view of the trial began to unravel. For the first time, Reed couldn't just rely on the surface-level assumptions that had guided his previous decisions. Marcus had forced him to look deeper, to question the very foundation of the case. The narrative that had seemed so straightforward, a stolen car, a chase, a guilty defendant, was suddenly no longer so clear-cut. Reed felt the weight of the truth Marcus had laid bare, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. The turning point came when Marcus dropped the final bombshell, the statement from the car's owner, Raymond Whitaker. Whitaker had told the police that the person he saw stealing the car was white. Marcus wasn't just defending himself against the charges. He was exposing how the prosecution had deliberately ignored key pieces of information that didn't fit their narrative. As Marcus outlined the gaps, the errors, and the omissions in the case against him, Reed couldn't shake the uncomfortable realization that the system had failed Marcus, and perhaps countless others like him. The evidence had been manipulated, ignored, and swept aside in favor of a quick conviction. Marcus wasn't just fighting for his freedom, he was fighting to reveal the truth that the system had been too willing to overlook. Judge Reed's discomfort grew as Marcus continued. The arrogance that had marked Reed's initial attitude began to fade, replaced by something much more complex. There was a deep, almost reluctant recognition in Reed's eyes that this case was not just about the LeWitt, was about how justice was often shaped by bias, assumption, and expedience. Marcus had exposed these flaws in a way that Reed could no longer ignore. He had made the judge see that this wasn't just a legal case, it was a glaring reflection of the systemic issues that plagued the courts. And so, with a heavy sigh and a moment of profound silence, Judge Reed made his decision. "Case dismissed," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the realization that the truth had won out, not because of the law, but because Marcus had forced the system to face itself. The words hung in the air like an unexpected gust of wind, unsettling everything that had come before. The courtroom erupted in a wave of disbelief, relief, and murmurs of shock. But Reed sat there still, a man confronted by his own assumptions, his own biases. He had thought this would be an easy case, but Marcus Hayes had shown him how wrong he was. In dismissing the case, Reed hadn't just made a legal ruling, he had acknowledged, in a small but significant way, that the system could be wrong, that it could fail. For a brief moment, the walls of the courtroom felt less like barriers and more like an open space for reflection. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, Reed's gaze followed him, no longer filled with the judgment he had initially held, but with something closer to regret. He had witnessed something rare in that courtroom, someone challenging the very system he had been a part of for so long. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would stay with him long after the case had been dismissed. The case of Marcus Hayes was more than just a courtroom drama. It was a stark reminder of the deep-seated flaws that exist within the justice system. For Marcus, the trial was never just about the charges he faced, but about exposing the biases, assumptions, and shortcuts that permeate the very fabric of the system. It wasn't until he stood up, representing himself with a clarity and precision that belied his age, that the real issue became clear. The justice system, in its eagerness to close cases, often forgets to ask the most basic question: what is the truth? As the trial unfolded, Marcus's defense wasn't just a legal strategy, it was a call to action, a challenge to everyone in that courtroom to look beyond the surface and recognize the human cost of hasty judgments. He wasn't just fighting to clear his name, he was fighting for the countless others who had been caught in the same web of assumptions, people whose voices had never been heard because they didn't have the means to challenge the system that condemned them. Marcus's ability to break down the prosecution's case wasn't just an act of self-preservation. It was a reflection of the way justice often overlooks those who are seen as expendable, as part of a system that cares more about efficiency than truth. The prosecution had relied on what seemed like irrefutable evidence: the fingerprints on the stolen car, the witness testimony, the supposed chase, but Marcus, with his sharp understanding of the law, showed how easily such evidence could be manipulated or misinterpreted. The prosecution had taken the easy route, assuming guilt based on surface-level facts and a story that fit their narrative. But Marcus wasn't willing to let the system decide his fate based on those assumptions. In his defense, he didn't just highlight the flaws in his case. He brought to light the broader issue of how people like him, young, black, and from a marginalized community, were too often treated as guilty before they even had the chance to prove their innocence. Marcus's challenge to the system wasn't just about one individual. It was about the countless others who, without his legal knowledge or the courage to stand up, might have been swept away by the very biases that clouded the judgment of those in power. When Marcus pointed out the discrepancies, the missing evidence, and the bias in the case against him, he forced the courtroom to confront its own failures. He made them realize that what they saw as a simple case was in fact an example of how justice too often gets it wrong, how people are presumed guilty based on race, background, or socioeconomic status, rather than the facts of the case. The message of Marcus's defense was not just a legal argument, it was a powerful reminder that justice cannot be blind to the truths that lie beneath the surface. It called for a more thoughtful, more compassionate approach to the law one that seeks not just to close cases, but to find the truth, no matter how inconvenient it may be. Marcus's fight was not just about his personal freedom. It was about making the system accountable to the people it was meant to protect. His victory, though personal, resonated far beyond the courtroom, shining a light on the injustices that are often ignored, and urging the need for change in a system that has far too long been built on assumptions rather than facts. Call to action. The trial of Marcus Hayes, though seemingly a singular case of legal defense, is a poignant call to action for all of us to critically examine the justice system that shapes the lives of so many. What Marcus's case exposed in a raw and powerful way was not just the potential for one man to be wrongfully accused, but the larger systemic issues that continue to affect countless individuals in this country. It's a system that far too often operates under the weight of assumptions, biases, and prejudices, rather than focusing on the pursuit of truth and justice. Marcus's defense wasn't just a tactical move to prove his innocence. It was an awakening, a reminder that the justice system is not infallible. It's a system run by people, and people are flawed. It's easy to point fingers and dismiss cases like Marcus's as isolated incidents, but the reality is that for many individuals, particularly those from marginalized communities, the system that is supposed to protect them has often worked against them. The fact that Marcus was able to expose the cracks in the case, to challenge the evidence and the assumptions stacked against him, should make us all pause and reflect. How many others, without the knowledge or resources to fight back, have been swept away by the same biases that nearly convicted him? The truth is, Marcus's victory was not just personal. It was a victory for anyone who has ever been treated unfairly by a system that is supposed to serve justice. It was a victory for those who have been labeled guilty because of where they came from, how they look, or the assumptions people make based on stereotypes. Marcus's story is a call for us to pay closer attention, to demand better from our institutions, and to advocate for those who may not have the power to speak up for themselves. It is a reminder that justice is not just about the law, it's about fairness, about ensuring that every individual, no matter their background or circumstances, is given the opportunity to have their voice heard and their case examined thoroughly and without prejudice. As a society, we must look at the way we approach justice. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and reform, especially in cases where the biases of the system may have already decided someone's fate. Marcus's defense should serve as a rallying cry for those who believe in fairness, for those who know that a system built on assumptions rather than facts cannot be trusted. We must stand together and make sure that the flaws Marcus exposed are addressed, that the people who are wrongly accused or unfairly treated are given the chance to have their voices heard and their rights protected. Marcus Hayes showed us that one person, armed with knowledge and courage, can challenge a system that is far too comfortable with its own flaws. He proved that the pursuit of truth can shift the tide, even when the odds are stacked against you. Now, it's our turn to carry that torch forward, to ensure that no one is ever silenced by a system that has failed them. The fight for justice is ongoing, and we must all be a part of it. If Marcus's story resonated with you, it's time to take action. Let's work to make sure the system that so many rely on is one that truly serves the people, all of them, without bias or unfair judgment. The change starts with us.